I'm fascinated by terrible games. The idea that a company actually took so much time and effort to release to market a game that anyone could plainly see is terrible is just fascinating to me, and as time goes on, some of these games reach legendary status. So I was wondering the other day, if we was to take a look at the worst games of each console generation, how would they stack up against each other? So, today we're going to kick that off with the best worst games of the 16-bit era. So, the first thing to take care of is which games to pick. Well, there's no way of picking the objectively worst games, it's all going to be subjective. What I did was to go over the hundreds of lists that people have made over the years of the worst games on each console and pick the ones that have appeared the most times near the top. It's not the most empirical way to pick the games, and there's no real way to get everyone to agree, but this is just a bit of fun after all. We're going to be comparing games for the main consoles of the 4th generation of gaming. We won't be taking a look at any games for 16-bit computers, as that's a rabbit hole I'm too scared to go down. We'll have an entry from the TurboGrafx 16, the Sega Mega Drive, the Super Nintendo, the Neo Geo AES and the Phillips CD-I. There are some other more obscure consoles that I'm not including. This is the Super ACAN, which was only released in Taiwan, the Commodore CD-TV, which is more of a computer, and the CPS Changer, which is a very limited version of the CPS arcade system you could use at home. There was also the Pioneer Laser Active, which should technically be in the era, but the main way to play games for it was to get modules, which played games for the other systems, as it only had a few games of its own. But they also required the modules from the other systems, and these games are so obscure that nobody has looked into them enough for there to be any consensus on which ones are the worst. So with that out of the way, let's go through each game, how I picked it, what it's like, and then compare it to the other selections. Let's start with the legendary Super Nintendo. It's my favourite console of that era, and one of my favourite of all time, holding so many great memories. Just like anything popular though, it has its share of stinkers, and there are some properly bad games on the SNES. Looking over all the lists though, the one that crops up most of the time near the top is Pit Fighter. I've only ever really played it once or twice, so for this video I got stuck in. Yeah, it deserves its reputation. Pit Fighter was originally released in the arcades in 1990, and it's important to remember that this was a fighting game that came out before Street Fighter 2, so the genre wasn't properly embedded yet. It became pretty famous due to its large digitised sprites and violent gameplay, and what's funny is that at the time it got pretty good reviews, both in the arcades and the home ports. People just liked these graphics and seemed fine with the gameplay. Now I can kind of see why they would be suckered in by the arcade, but the port to the SNES is just terrible. So you start off by picking a character and then you're straight in the match. You'll immediately notice a bit of a downgrade from the arcade version. Everything is just a muddy pixelated mess, it looks awful. The fighting mechanics consist of spamming the punches and kicks and hoping you hit the opponent before they hit you. There's no semblance of strategy. If you eventually manage to pummel the opponent before they pummel you, you'll move on to the next level, and guess what? You don't get your health back. This was fine in our arcade game. This is meant to be a home version. It makes it pretty hard to progress to the next stage unless you become a master, of which there is no point. Ugly graphics, bad game, don't like. It's time for the worst Mega Drive game. For this one, it was clear what it had to be. It's not enough that it features top of most people's lists, but Shaq Fu is so infamous that a website was even made back in the day dedicated to destroying all copies of it. Shaq Fu is a fighting game that features Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball player, as the main character in a fantasy fighting world. Do you really need to know anything else? So the game starts off with Shaq Fu in downtown Tokyo with a huge Pepsi sign behind him, taking in the sights before his all-star charity game. And would you know it, he stumbles upon a Kung Fu dojo. Of course, there is another Pepsi sign. The main attraction to this dojo for Shaq appears to be that there is an old man inside, so in he goes. The old man calls him Big Warrior and immediately assumes he's from the stars. Shaq tries to play it cool, he's a smooth player, but he senses the chemistry. He invites the old man to his big game tonight. He saw the old man from the window and that's what made him come in after all. The old man then tells Shaq to prove he's the magic one by saving a little boy called Nezu. Shaq's obviously a little confused, but he isn't going to miss his chance with the old man and prove he's the magic one, so he does what he says and goes through a portal. And then the game just starts. You can now travel to one of the locations in the game in order to fight the bad guys. Now, given that Shaq knows nothing about this little boy, if a big man in tight shorts was to roll into a village and tell them that an old man had told him to go and collect a little boy, I think it's pretty obvious why he's getting into fights. I think I'm on the bad guy's side. When the fighting starts, it's just terrible. The controls are so imprecise and floaty. Jumping is on a fixed path, so when you jump forward, you just float about unable to hit anything or control your movement. The characters are quite small, but the stage is large, so it ends up being just a case of trying to get into a position where you can try and hit them. To be honest, the graphics aren't the worst thing in the world. They are completely uninspired and generic, but at least the backgrounds have some depth to them, and there is animation in the backgrounds, so that gives it some credit. Unfortunately, the gameplay is just awful. Shaq is certainly not the magic one. This one was hard to pick. The TurboGrafx 16 wasn't as popular as the Mega Drive or SNES, but it developed a bit of a cult following, to the point where the people that talk about it nowadays are generally people that love the console and still do. This means that getting a general consensus on what the worst game for the console is was pretty difficult. Searching around, it seems as if Darkwing Duck is the popular choice for many people. It was covered by the AVGN at one point, but it's long been known for its subpar quality. The game starts off with a fairly generic story about stopping some bad guys before letting you pick your level. The music is noticeably bad. I don't think it can really be described as music, it's more a couple of samples repeated on loop. When you get into a level, the graphics are okay, a little flat, but there are some worse looking games. What kills it though is the unbelievably poor gameplay and controls. The platforming is just terrible, the hit detection is completely off, landing on things is near impossible, and the game just throws things at you constantly. Tiny enemies you can't hit, obstacles you can't avoid, or just not being able to hit anything. The constant droning of the same music over and over just makes this one unbearable. Now on to the Neo Geo AES. It's normally known as a bastion of quality, arcade perfect versions of SNK's greatest games of the generation. It was basically a mini arcade machine for the home. That being said, it had some pretty bad games, just like any other system. We'll be looking at Legend of Success Joe, which is considered by many Neo Geo collectors to be the system's biggest stinker. It's effectively a boxing game in which you follow Joe and his rags to riches story, starting out as a fighter in the streets before ending up as a professional champion. The graphics are okay. It's pretty normal SNK fare, with big sprites and animated backgrounds. The music isn't awful too, it's generic, but it certainly doesn't sound bad. The main problem with this one is it's very imprecise and difficult. The fights consist of sort of flailing the punches about, hoping you hit something. You don't have a whole lot of control over what kind of punch you throw, so you can end up throwing a hook when a jab would work best. It makes the game come down to luck, which is the opposite of what a good SNK fighter should be. Ultimately though, I think there is still some fun to be had out of it. When you do land a hit on the opponent, there's a nice impact, and just has that cheese factor, which makes it a little endearing. And finally, we have the Phillips CD-I. The Phillips CD-I gets a hard time by a lot of people for its games, but you have to remember that it was never really supposed to be a games console. It was supposed to be a multimedia system for educational titles, perhaps some movies, music, that sort of thing. It's only when Philips noticed that the games were the best selling pieces of software when they tried to pivot to releasing more games for it, which was always going to be a mistake, as it just wasn't well equipped. That being said, none of that explanation actually makes the games any better. Picking the worst game for this one was difficult, as there are lots of titles which can be barely considered games. It seems though, the one that pops up on most lists the most often was either Alien Gate or Dark Castle. Having tried them both out, I think Dark Castle just pips it as being worse. Dark Castle has kind of an interesting history, in that it was originally released to the Mac in 1986 and wasn't bad, with one of the drawing points being its excellent animations for the time. Unfortunately, it kept being ported to other systems, and as the ports went on, the quality seemed to get considerably worse, with the 1992 CD-I release probably being the worst one. There was apparently a port for the MSX later too, but I'm not sure if this was ever commercially released, as there isn't much evidence for it. When you start the game, it looks bad, but to be honest, these are the sort of cartoony graphics that the CD-I was capable of when it wasn't playing video from a disc. It's the controls which are just ungodly. Moving about is a chore, and it feels like one of those games made nowadays where it's intentionally hard to control the character, like Octodad, but with none of the charm or fun factor. The main character just constantly falls over, platforming is just ridiculous, and actually hitting enemies is a nightmare. It's bad. So, it's time to rank all the games up against each other. Let's start with the worst game, and work our way up this inglorious ladder to the best worst game of the 16-bit generation. So, in my opinion, the worst game is Pit Fighter. Yes, it's going even lower than Dark Castle. The reason for this is that with Dark Castle, even though it's terrible in pretty much every way, you can at least get some slight chuckle from the ridiculousness of it all. But with Pit Fighter, there's absolutely nothing enjoyable. Serotonin levels are at 0%, please delete. The second worst game is Dark Castle. It's fundamentally broken and does everything wrong. Then we have Darkwing Duck as the third worst, as whilst the controls and gameplay and music are horrendous, at least the graphics have a little bit of charm to them. In second place is Shaq Fu, a horrible mess of a game, but I think it's pretty funny to laugh at. Then finally, the best worst game is The Legend of Success Joe. Yes, it's a bad game with imprecise controls and is completely frustrating to the point of wanting to smash it, but at the very least it does have some fun moments and there is the slightest sliver of potential in the early levels. Well, that was my list. Let me know what your pick would be of the best worst game of the 16-bit generation. Thanks for watching. Please make sure to subscribe to my channel, share the video and take a look at my socials in the pinned comment. Goodbye!